Margaret Harper was the kind of person everyone noticed, whether they wanted to or not. At 58, she carried herself with an air of authority that made even the most stubborn neighbors think twice before leaving their trash cans out too long. As the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA, Margaret took her job seriously, perhaps a little too seriously. Every morning, rain or shine, she would grab her clipboard, slip on her favorite wide-brimmed hat, and set off on her daily rounds through the quiet suburban streets. Her mission? To ensure every blade of grass was trimmed, every mailbox stood straight, and every car was parked exactly where it should be. Willow Creek was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked perfect, from the freshly painted fences to the flower beds bursting with color. It was a place where people moved to escape the chaos of city life and enjoy some peace and quiet. And Margaret? Well, she was determined to keep it that way. She had lived in Willow Creek for over 2 decades and considered it her personal responsibility to maintain its charm. Some might call her strict. Others might say she was just passionate about her community. Either way, no one could deny that Margaret knew how to get things done. One sunny Tuesday morning, as Margaret strolled down the cul-de-sac near the sparkling community pool, something unusual caught her eye. Parked right beside the no parking sign was a sleek black Dodge Charger. It wasn't like the other cars in the neighborhood, minivans, sedans, and the occasional SUV. This car screamed power and speed, with shiny chrome rims and a muscular frame that seemed out of place among the modest family vehicles. But what really made Margaret pause were the bold white letters printed across its sides: police. Her first thought was confusion. Why would a police car be parked here? There hadn't been any reports of trouble in Willow Creek lately. No burglaries, no accidents, nothing that would require law enforcement attention. Her second thought was suspicion. Something about this didn't feel right. The car sat there silently, its windows tinted so darkly that Margaret couldn't see inside. She knocked lightly on the driver's side window, half expecting an officer to roll it down and explain what was going on. But there was no response, just silence. Margaret stepped back and studied the car more closely. The license plate caught her attention next. Instead of the standard issue plates issued by the state, this one read, VIN DZL. Who on earth named their car that? And why would a police vehicle have such a flashy vanity plate? Margaret frowned. None of this added up. If this was a real police car, why was it left unattended in a residential area? And if it wasn't, well, that raised even more questions. As she jotted down notes on her clipboard, Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Was this some sort of prank? A stolen vehicle? Or maybe someone trying to show off? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. This car was violating HOA rules. It was parked illegally, disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood, and Margaret wasn't about to let it slide. After all, rules existed for a reason: to protect the integrity of the community. With a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the towing company she always relied on when residents ignored parking regulations. Little did Margaret know, this decision would lead to a chain of events that would turn her predictable world upside down and make her the talk of not just Willow Creek but the entire internet. As Margaret stood there staring at the mysterious black Dodge Charger, her mind began to swirl with questions. Who would park a police car in her quiet little neighborhood? And why would they leave it unattended, especially in such an obvious spot near the community pool? The more she thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. Margaret wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about this situation didn't sit right with her. She circled the car slowly, inspecting it from every angle. The police decals on the sides were bold and official-looking, but something felt off. Real police cars usually had markings that included the department's name or badge number, but this one was strangely plain. Just the word police, nothing else. It was almost like someone had slapped those decals on as an afterthought. And then there was the license plate, VIN DZL. Margaret couldn't help but chuckle under her breath. What kind of officer, or person for that matter, would choose such a flashy, attention-grabbing plate? It seemed more like something a teenager might pick for their first car than something you'd see on an actual police vehicle. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some harmless prank. What if the car had been stolen? Or worse, what if it belonged to someone trying to impersonate a police officer? She'd heard stories on the news about criminals using fake police cars to pull people over and rob them. Could that be happening here? In Willow Creek? Margaret shuddered at the thought. Her neighborhood was supposed to be safe, a place where kids could ride their bikes without worry and families could enjoy summer barbecues in peace. The idea of a potential criminal lurking nearby made her blood boil. Determined to get answers, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, snapping a few pictures of the car. If it turned out to be stolen, or worse, she wanted evidence. Then she called the local police department, hoping they could shed some light on the situation. When the dispatcher answered, Margaret explained what she'd found, describing the car in detail and giving its location. But instead of sounding alarmed, the dispatcher simply asked her to hold on while they checked their records. A few minutes later, the dispatcher returned to the line. "Ma'am," they said, "we don't have any units matching that description operating in your area today. Are you sure it's a real police car?" Margaret's stomach dropped, so it wasn't legitimate. That meant this car was either stolen, fake, or part of some elaborate scheme. The dispatcher thanked her for reporting it and promised to send an officer to investigate. But Margaret knew she couldn't wait around. By the time the police arrived, whoever owned this car could easily come back and drive off, leaving no trace behind. That's when Margaret remembered the towing company. She kept their number saved in her phone for situations exactly like this. One of the perks of being HOA president was knowing who to call when rules were broken. With a deep breath, she dialed the number and explained the situation. "There's a suspicious vehicle parked illegally near the pool," she said firmly. "It needs to be removed immediately." The operator assured her that a tow truck would be there within the hour, and Margaret hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. At least she was doing something to protect her neighborhood. While she waited, Margaret paced back and forth, glancing at the charger every few seconds. She half expected someone to come running out of nowhere, demanding to know what she was doing. But the street remained eerily quiet. Birds chirped in the distance, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers drifted through the air. Everything seemed so normal, yet Margaret couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was missing something important. Why would someone go through the trouble of making a car look like a police cruiser, only to abandon it in her cul-de-sac? When the tow truck finally arrived, Margaret watched as the driver expertly hooked up the charger and hoisted it onto the flatbed. As the engine roared to life and the truck began to pull away, Margaret felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, she'd done her duty as HOA president, removing a potential threat from her community. On the other hand, she still had no idea who the car belonged to, or why it had been there in the first place. Little did she know, the answers were far stranger and more entertaining than anything she could have imagined. Margaret watched as the tow truck driver secured the sleek black Charger onto the flatbed, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. She felt a surge of satisfaction wash over her. The car was gone, and with it, the disruption to her otherwise perfect neighborhood. Order had been restored thanks to her quick thinking and unwavering dedication to the rules. But even as she stood there basking in the momentary triumph, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered that something about this whole situation still didn't add up. The driver of the tow truck tipped his cap at her before climbing back into the cab. "You sure this is the right call, ma'am?" he asked, glancing at the Charger one last time. "Looks like an expensive piece of machinery." "It's violating HOA regulations," Margaret replied firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And besides, it's suspicious. No legitimate police car just sits unattended in a residential area like this." The driver shrugged, clearly not wanting to get involved in whatever drama might follow. He gave her a polite nod, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Margaret alone on the quiet street. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The sun warmed her skin, and the faint scent of blooming flowers filled the air. Everything seemed normal again, or so she thought. As she turned to head back home, Margaret noticed something strange. A group of people had gathered near the edge of the cul-de-sac, whispering among themselves and pointing toward the spot where the Charger had been parked. Curious, she walked over to see what all the fuss was about. One of the neighbors, a young man named Tim who worked in IT, greeted her with wide eyes. "Margaret," he said, barely containing his excitement, "do you have any idea whose car that was?" She shook her head, already regretting asking. "I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. It broke the rules, so it got towed." End of story. Tim exchanged glances with the others before leaning in closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "That car belongs to Vin Diesel." Margaret blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "Vin who?" "Diesel," Tim repeated, enunciating each syllable. "You know the actor? From those Fast and Furious movies? Apparently they're filming a scene nearby, and that car is part of the movie set." For a second, Margaret just stared at him, her brain struggling to process what he'd said. "That's ridiculous," she finally muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "Why would Vin Diesel park his car here? And why would a movie crew come to Willow Creek? This isn't Hollywood." But the more she thought about it, the more doubt crept in. The flashy license plate, Vin Diesel, suddenly made sense. The decals on the car weren't standard issue police markings. They looked almost theatrical. And then there were the cameras. Earlier, when she'd first spotted the car, she'd noticed a few people milling around with equipment slung over their shoulders. At the time, she'd assumed they were contractors or utility workers. Now, she wasn't so sure. Her heart began to race as the reality of the situation sunk in. She hadn't just towed some random suspicious vehicle. She'd towed a prop car belonging to one of the biggest action stars in the world, and possibly disrupted an entire film shoot in the process. Panic bubbled up in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Surely someone would contact her soon to explain everything. Until then, she decided to keep quiet about it. After all, no one else needed to know what she'd done. Right? Wrong. As it turned out, the neighborhood grapevine was faster than Margaret anticipated. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire that the HOA president had towed Vin Diesel's car. Neighbors who had previously avoided Margaret now flocked to her, eager to hear the details. Some laughed nervously, while others bombarded her with questions. "What are you going to do?" one woman asked, clutching her gardening gloves. "Do you think he'll sue us?" Margaret swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she said stiffly, though inside she was anything but calm. All she could think about was how this incident might tarnish her reputation, and worse, bring unwanted attention to Willow Creek. What if the film crew decided to pack up and leave because of her mistake? Or worse, what if Vin Diesel himself showed up demanding answers? Just as these thoughts swirled in her mind, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, but curious, she answered. On the other end of the line was a man, who introduced himself as the producer of the film shoot. His tone was polite but firm as he explained the situation. The Charger was indeed part of the production, and its removal had caused significant delays. They needed it back immediately. Or else. Margaret's stomach churned as she listened. She stammered out an apology, promising to fix the situation right away. But deep down, she knew this was far from over. Somehow, in the span of a single morning, her simple act of enforcing HOA rules had spiraled into something much bigger and potentially disastrous. Margaret hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. The producer's voice still echoed in her ears, calm but firm, with an undercurrent of frustration that made her feel about 2 inches tall. She had towed a car belonging to Vin Diesel, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and now an entire film crew was waiting for her to fix the mess she'd created. It was surreal, like something out of a comedy movie. Only this wasn't funny. It was real life, and Margaret was at the center of it. She took a deep breath and called the towing company again, explaining the situation as best she could without letting her panic show. "Listen," she said, trying to sound authoritative despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I need you to tell me exactly where that car is right now, and I need it released immediately." The operator on the other end paused before responding. "Ma'am, the car's already been taken to the impound lot. You'll have to go down there yourself if you want it released." Margaret groaned inwardly. Of course it wouldn't be simple. Nothing about this day had been simple. With no other options, she grabbed her keys, climbed into her sedan, and drove to the impound lot, which was located on the outskirts of town. As she pulled into the gravel parking lot, she spotted the Charger sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by rows of rusted sedans and dented trucks. Despite its surroundings, the car still looked impressive, gleaming even in the dim light. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered nearby, whispering and pointing at the famous vehicle. Margaret approached the office, where a grizzled man with a clipboard sat behind a scratched-up counter. He raised an eyebrow when he saw her. "You're here for the Charger?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Margaret replied, forcing herself to sound confident. "It's, mine. Well, not mine personally, but it belongs to someone very important. I need it released right away." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, do you have any idea how many people come in here claiming cars aren't theirs? I'm gonna need some proof." "Proof? Of course." Margaret hadn't thought that far ahead. She fumbled through her purse, pulling out her phone and scrolling through the photos she'd taken earlier. She showed him the image of the license plate, Vin Diesel, and explained that the car belonged to Vin Diesel, who was filming a movie nearby. To her surprise, the man's expression softened slightly. "Oh, so that's why everyone's been asking about it," he muttered, scratching his chin. "Yeah, we've had a couple calls already. Some big-shot producer or something. Look, I'll release it, but you're gonna have to sign some paperwork first." Relieved, Margaret quickly filled out the forms while mentally preparing herself for the next step, contacting the film crew. By the time she walked back outside, the Charger was being lowered off the tow truck, its shiny surface catching the fading sunlight. A few bystanders snapped pictures with their phones, and Margaret couldn't help but feel self-conscious as she stood beside the car, looking more like a school principal than someone involved in a Hollywood production. When she finally reached the producer by phone again, she apologized profusely, explaining that the car was ready to be picked up. The producer, though still annoyed, thanked her and promised to send someone over right away. As they ended the call, Margaret leaned against her sedan, exhaling deeply. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to relax, at least a little. But she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Later that evening, as she sat in her living room flipping through channels, she came across a news segment about the film shoot in Willow Creek. There was footage of Vin Diesel himself, smiling broadly as he greeted fans and posed for photos. Margaret froze, staring at the screen. This was the man whose car she had towed. He looked larger than life, charismatic and effortlessly cool. How on earth was she supposed to face him after what she'd done? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was another message from the producer, confirming that the car had been retrieved and thanking her once more for her cooperation. Attached to the text was a photo of Vin Diesel standing beside the Charger, giving a thumbs up. Margaret stared at the image, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She had caused so much. The next morning, Margaret woke up with a sense of dread weighing heavily on her shoulders. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over again. Towing Vin Diesel's car? No, not just any car, but a prop. For a major Hollywood film, was bad enough. But now the entire neighborhood knew about it. As she stepped outside to grab the newspaper, she could already hear whispers from across the street. Neighbors who usually avoided eye contact were suddenly eager to chat, their faces lighting up with equal parts amusement and disbelief. "Margaret," called Mrs. Peterson, leaning over her white picket fence. "Did you really tow Vin Diesel's car? I heard he's coming here today." Margaret forced a smile, clutching the rolled-up newspaper tightly in her hand. "It was an honest mistake," she said, trying to sound dismissive. "And yes, apparently he is. Mrs. Peterson clapped her hands together like a giddy teenager. Oh, this is so exciting. Willow Creek will be famous. Famous? The word sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Famous wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was for everything to go back to normal, for the streets to be quiet, the rules to be followed, and her clipboard to feel useful again. Instead, she felt like the main character in some bizarre sitcom, where every decision she made only led to more chaos. As the morning wore on, the buzz around town grew louder. People began gathering near the community pool, hoping to catch a glimpse of Vin Diesel or the film crew. Kids carried posters they'd hastily made with markers and glitter, while parents snapped photos of the production equipment being set up. Even the local news station showed up, parking their van along the curb and interviewing anyone willing to talk about the HOA president who towed Vin Diesel's car. Margaret peeked out her window, watching the scene unfold with mounting anxiety. This was supposed to be her peaceful little suburb, not a circus. By late afternoon, the moment she had been dreading arrived. A sleek black SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac, and out stepped Vin Diesel himself. He was taller than she expected, his muscular frame accentuated by a fitted leather jacket and aviator sunglasses. Despite the commotion surrounding him, he moved, with an easy confidence that made everyone stop and stare. Margaret froze, her heart pounding as he approached her driveway. One of the producers walked alongside him, gesturing toward Margaret. "This is her," the producer said with a grin. "The infamous HOA president." Vin Diesel removed his sunglasses, revealing warm, amused eyes. He extended a hand toward Margaret, who hesitated for a split second before shaking it. His grip was firm but friendly, and his deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Ms. Harper, right? I've heard all about you." Margaret swallowed hard, her cheeks burning. "Mr. Diesel, I can't tell you how sorry I am. I had no idea the car belonged to you, or that it was part of your movie. If I'd known..." He held up a hand, cutting her off mid-apology. "Hey, don't worry about it," he said with a chuckle. "You were just doing your job. Honestly, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. People see those police decals and assume the worst. Trust me, I get it." Relief washed over Margaret, though she still felt embarrassed. She glanced at the crowd of neighbors watching intently, their phones raised to capture the moment. "Still, I caused a lot of trouble for you and your team. Is there anything I can do to make it up to you?" Vin tilted his head thoughtfully, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Actually, there is one thing." Margaret braced herself, imagining the worst. A lawsuit, a hefty fine, maybe even a lifetime ban from attending any future film screenings. But instead, Vin grinned and said, "How would you like to make a cameo in the movie?" Her jaw dropped. Cameo?" "Yeah," he replied, shrugging casually. "We're shooting a scene tomorrow where the hero gets confronted by an overzealous authority figure. Someone like you, an HOA president maybe, would be perfect for the role. What do you say?" Margaret blinked, stunned. This was the last thing she expected. Acting in a movie? Her? It sounded absurd, but also kind of thrilling. Before she could respond, Vin added, "Don't worry, we'll guide you through it. And hey, it'll give your neighbors something else to talk about." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Margaret found herself nodding slowly, a hesitant smile creeping onto her face. Maybe this whole ordeal wasn't such a disaster after all. In fact, it might turn out to be the most unforgettable experience of her life. As Vin turned to leave, waving goodbye to the adoring crowd, Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would step onto a real movie set and act alongside one of Hollywood's biggest stars. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and completely unexpected. For the first time in years, Margaret realized that breaking the mold, even accidentally, could lead to something extraordinary. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual, her mind buzzing with a mix of excitement and nerves. She stood in front of her closet, staring blankly at her clothes as if trying to find the perfect outfit for, well, what exactly? A movie set? She settled on a simple yet polished look, A crisp white blouse paired with navy slacks and sensible flats. After all, she wasn't there to steal the spotlight. She was just playing an exaggerated version of herself. A no-nonsense HOA president confronting Vin Diesel's character. Still, as she added a delicate strand of pearls around her neck, she couldn't help but feel like this day was going to be anything but ordinary. When she arrived at the filming location near the community pool, the scene was nothing short of chaotic. Crew members scurried back and forth, adjusting lights, setting up cameras, and shouting instructions into walkie-talkies. The Charger sat proudly in the center of it all, looking every bit the star car it was. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the action. Some waved enthusiastically when they spotted Margaret, whispering loudly about how she's going to be in the movie. A young assistant approached her, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Harper, we're ready for you whenever you are. Just follow me." Margaret nodded, clutching her purse tightly as she followed the assistant onto the set. It felt surreal to step into this world where everything seemed larger than life. Someone handed her a script page with her lines highlighted in yellow. She scanned it quickly, her heart skipping a beat. Her role was small but memorable. She would confront Vin Diesel's character about parking violations, only to have him charm his way out of trouble. It was funny, lighthearted, and surprisingly relatable. "Okay, Ms. Harper," the director said warmly, shaking her hand. "Don't worry too much about getting everything perfect. We'll guide you through it. Just try to act natural. You're basically playing yourself." Playing herself sounded easy enough, right? Wrong. When the cameras started rolling and Vin Diesel walked onto the set, Margaret suddenly forgot how to breathe. He gave her a reassuring wink before delivering his line with effortless charisma. Then it was her turn. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of words, a strange squeak came out. The crew erupted into laughter, and even Vin chuckled good-naturedly. "It's okay," he said, stepping out of character for a moment. "Let's take it again. You've got this." With each retake, Margaret grew more comfortable. By the third attempt, she delivered her line with just the right amount of sternness, earning applause from the crew. For someone who had spent decades enforcing rules and keeping order, pretending to do so in front of a camera wasn't half bad. After wrapping her scene, Margaret was whisked away to make up for touch-ups, while Vin prepared for his next shot. As she sat in the chair, watching the flurry of activity around her, she realized something surprising. She was having fun. This wasn't the rigid, rule-bound existence she'd grown accustomed to. It was spontaneous, unpredictable, and thrilling. Later that evening, after the day's filming wrapped, Vin invited her to join the cast and crew for dinner. At first, Margaret hesitated, feeling out of place among the glamorous actors and filmmakers. But Vin insisted, introducing her to everyone with genuine warmth. They laughed about the towing incident, turning it into a running joke that left Margaret blushing, but smiling nonetheless. By the end of the night, she felt like part of the team, or at least a very lucky guest. As she drove home, exhausted but exhilarated, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about how much had changed in just 2 days. What started as a disastrous misunderstanding had turned into an adventure she never saw coming. And though she doubted she'd ever trade her clipboard for a career in Hollywood, one thing was certain. Margaret Harper was finally learning to embrace the unexpected turns life could take, even if they involved towing a movie star's car. In the days following her cameo appearance, Margaret became an overnight sensation, not just in Willow Creek but far beyond. The story of how she towed Vin Diesel's car and then ended up acting alongside him in his movie spread like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up first, running segments that featured interviews with neighbors and snippets of footage from the film shoot. Before long, national outlets caught wind of the tale, dubbing her the HOA president who stole the show. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags like Margaret vs. Vin and clipboards and chargers, turning her into an unlikely internet celebrity. Back in Willow Creek, life took on a festive energy. Neighbors who once groaned about Margaret's strict enforcement of HOA rules now greeted her with smiles and playful jokes. "Hey, Margaret," one man called out as she walked past his driveway. "When's your next blockbuster coming out?" She laughed, shaking her head, but secretly she loved the attention. For years she'd been the woman everyone respected, but rarely liked. Now, she was the woman everyone wanted to talk to. The local coffee shop even created a special drink in her honor, the Margaret Mocha, complete with whipped cream and a chocolate clip-shaped garnish. When she stopped by for her usual morning latte, the barista handed it to her free of charge. "On the house," he said with a wink. "You're making our town famous." But fame wasn't all fun and games. As the story gained traction, reporters began showing up at her doorstep, eager for quotes or photos. At first, Margaret politely declined their requests, unsure how to handle the sudden spotlight. But after some encouragement from Vin Diesel himself, who called her personally to thank her for being such a good sport, she decided to lean into the moment. She gave a few interviews, sharing her side of the story with humility and humor. "I'm just glad no one got hurt," she told one reporter, laughing. "Except maybe my pride." Her newfound popularity also brought unexpected opportunities. A local bookstore invited her to host a book club event where attendees could hear her thoughts on leadership and community building. A charity organization asked her to speak at their annual gala, using her story to inspire others to embrace life's surprises. Even the mayor of Willow Creek reached out, offering her a ceremonial key to the city. "For putting us on the map," he joked during the presentation. Despite all the excitement, Margaret remained grounded. She continued her daily rounds through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, ensuring that everything stayed in order. But something had shifted within her. Where once she might have scolded a neighbor for leaving a lawn chair too close to the sidewalk, she now approached them with a smile and a gentle reminder. Her encounter with Vin Diesel, and the whirlwind of events that followed, had taught her the value of flexibility and grace. Rules were important, yes, but so was understanding. As weeks turned into months, anticipation grew for the release of the movie. Posters featuring Vin Diesel's rugged face and the iconic Charger began appearing in theaters, teasing scenes from the high-octane action flick. To everyone's delight, including Margaret's, trailers included a brief clip of her cameo. In it, she delivered her line with perfect comedic timing, earning laughs from audiences around the world. Friends and family texted her screenshots and videos, giddy with excitement. "You're going to be immortalized," her granddaughter wrote. "This is so cool." When opening night finally arrived, the entire neighborhood gathered at the local cinema for a special screening. The theater buzzed with energy as people settled into their seats, clutching buckets of popcorn and soda. When Margaret appeared, on screen the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. For those few seconds, she wasn't just the HOA president, she was a star. After the credits rolled, Margaret stood outside the theater, surrounded by well-wishers and fans. Someone handed her a bouquet of flowers, while another neighbor presented her with a framed photo of her and Vin Diesel from the set. As she looked around at the smiling faces, she realized something profound. This experience had changed not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. Life didn't always have to follow a script, and sometimes breaking the rules led to the most unforgettable moments of all. In the weeks that followed the movie's release, Margaret found herself reflecting on how much her life had transformed. The film was a massive success, praised by critics and audiences alike for its thrilling car chases, heartfelt moments, and, of course, the unexpected charm of its cameo appearances. Margaret's brief scene became one of the most talked about parts of the movie, with fans online dubbing her the accidental hero. Memes featuring her stern expression alongside Vin Diesel's trademark smirk popped up everywhere, and hashtags like Margaret Rules trended for days. But it wasn't just the internet that celebrated her newfound fame. Back in Willow Creek, neighbors treated her like royalty. Kids who once groaned at her reminders about sidewalk bikes now stopped to ask for autographs. Local businesses hung posters of her in their windows, declaring her an honorary ambassador of the town. Even the HOA meetings she used to dread hosting were suddenly packed with attendees eager to hear her stories from the set. Margaret couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Enforcing rules had made her unpopular, but breaking them, albeit accidentally, had turned her into a beloved figure. Still, Margaret knew deep down that this whirlwind of attention wouldn't last forever. As the initial buzz faded, she began to think about what she wanted to take away from the experience. It wasn't the fame or the accolades that mattered to her. It was the lessons she'd learned along the way. For so long, she'd clung to her clipboard and her rules as if they were the only things keeping chaos at bay. But towing Vin Diesel's car, and everything that came after, had taught her something invaluable. Life was messy, unpredictable, and often hilarious. And sometimes, embracing that unpredictability could lead to experiences more rewarding than any rulebook could offer. Margaret decided to channel this new perspective into her role as HOA president. She still cared deeply about maintaining order in Willow Creek, but she started doing it with a lighter touch. When a teenager left his skateboard on the curb overnight, instead of issuing a warning, she knocked on his door and joked, "I won't tow this yet." When a neighbor planted flowers that technically violated the color scheme guidelines, she complimented their creativity rather than demanding changes. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to feel less like a place governed by rigid rules and more like a community united by shared joy. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. One evening, during a casual gathering at the community pool, several neighbors approached her with gifts. A custom t-shirt that read HOA Hero, a scrapbook filled with photos from the movie shoot, and even a hand-painted portrait of her standing beside the charger. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she accepted each gift, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "This has been the adventure of a lifetime." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the pool, Margaret sat quietly on a lounge chair watching the laughter and chatter around her. She thought back to the woman she'd been before all of this happened, the woman who lived by checklists and schedules, convinced that perfection was the key to happiness. Now she realized that happiness came not from control, but from connection. From saying yes to unexpected opportunities even when they seemed daunting or downright ridiculous. Months later, when the film premiered on streaming platforms, Margaret hosted a cozy watch party at her house. Neighbors brought snacks and blankets, settling onto couches and floor cushions as the opening credits rolled. When her scene appeared on screen, everyone cheered wildly, raising their glasses in a toast to her. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with belonging. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, Margaret replayed the events of the past year in her mind. From the moment she spotted that mysterious black Charger to her cameo alongside Vin Diesel, every twist and turn had led her here, to a place where she felt truly seen, appreciated, and alive. Life, she realized, was like a movie, full of surprises, challenges, and moments worth savoring. And while she might never step foot on a film set again, she knew one thing for certain. She was ready for whatever adventure came next.